G'day friends, it's Andrew here again from Nature's Image Photography, and for the first time in a while I've had a chance to try out a new lens on my Panasonic Lumix G9. The Leica Panasonic 15mm f1.7 lens came to me on loan from Panasonic Australia, and while I can't say I've given it a thorough workout, I have done enough to give you some first impressions and show you some initial photos. Before we start, be sure to subscribe if you enjoy seeing content on Lumix cameras, and if you really find my videos helpful, you can always thank me with a coffee using the link below. The 15mm f1.7 came in a box with some other goodies, and to be honest I wasn't exactly sure what to make of it at first. Regular viewers will remember I even asked for suggestions in my last video on how I might use it. 25mm is a standard lens for a micro four thirds camera, so at 15mm this lens is a wide angle, but not super wide for big landscapes. The f1.7 makes me think of a portrait lens, but the wide-angle exaggerated perspective can look a bit odd for a close-up style of portrait. So I was interested to read those comments, and here's how other photographers are using this lens. Some people said they found it useful as a general-purpose walk-around lens that can do a little bit of everything. In particular, a lot of people found it great for street photography and indoor events where you might be shooting in low light. Some are using it for portraits, in particular for more environmental portraits where you want to shoot a bit more of the surroundings and not just the model. And with that big wide 1.7 aperture, some said it's good for low light landscape photos, perhaps before sunrise and after sunset. Let's keep all that in mind as we go through the video, but before we look any further at applications, let's take a look at the lens itself. The first thing you notice is how tiny it is, even by micro four thirds standards. The whole thing, including the lens mount, is about 4 cm long, and when attached to the camera it only extends 3.6 cm from the camera body. Here it is next to my Olympus 45mm f1.8 portrait lens. Now when I bought that lens I commented how amazing it was that such a good lens could be so tiny, and this lens is very comparable in size and it's almost exactly the same weight. It's a mostly metal construction and it feels solid and well built. But at just 115 grams, you wouldn't think twice about keeping it handy because it's not adding any real weight to your camera bag. With aperture control you have two options. If you want to go old school, there's an aperture ring on the lens where you can choose your f-stop manually. The numbers on the aperture ring are shown in full stop increments, but the apertures go a third of a stop at a time, and you can feel the gentle click as each knot slides into place. The other option is to turn the dial all the way with a slightly heftier click into the A position, and then the aperture can be controlled using the aperture control dial on the camera. You can see here that when I use the ring on the lens to select f2.8, then turning the control dial on the camera does nothing. And if this looks a bit backwards to you, remember I have my aperture setting assigned to the rear dial. But when I switch the ring on the lens to A, then the control dial takes over and I can set the aperture the same way I do with my other Panasonic lenses. This is how I prefer to operate the aperture, and this is where I have one minor quibble with the lens. It's fairly easy to knock the aperture ring out of that A position without meaning to, just through your normal handling of the camera. And of course when that happens my control dial stops working. Now this is only a very minor issue because it only takes me 2 seconds to realise what's happened and to reach forward and click it back into the A position. I should also mention this lens came to me second hand, so I have no idea how much use it's had in the past, and possibly the A position would hold in place a bit more firmly on a new lens. Now let's look at focus, and there's a switch on the side of the lens for choosing between autofocus and manual focus. It sits just behind the manual focus ring. This one is a good firm click, and when the lens is on the camera it's right back close to the body in a spot where you're unlikely to ever knock it by accident. The action of the manual focus ring is very smooth, with just the right level of resistance to feel easy and natural. Now here's a little tip that was given to me by some of my subscribers. If you have the lens switched to manual focus, even if the camera body is set to autofocus, then the focus can only happen manually. But that's only true if you're using the front shutter button to focus and shoot. If you're using back button focus, which I've talked about in a couple of my recent videos, then you can get the best of both worlds. With the lens switched to MF and the body switched to AF, you can manually focus using the lens and still apply autofocus by pressing the AF AE lock button on the back of the camera. Being a Leica Panasonic lens, I think it goes without saying that the autofocus for still photos is accurate and sharp. I've used it with single point and human animal detect, and it's as good as any lens I've used on the G9. Shooting video in AFC, it transitions nicely from foreground to background without looking jerky, and it's whisper quiet. Indoors in a quiet room you can just hear the sound of the autofocus motor working. Outdoors with a slight breeze or any other ambient noise and you won't hear it at all. Finally, on focus, the minimum focus distance is just 20 centimeters, and when you combine close focus like that with the 1.7 aperture, the depth of field becomes shallow enough to produce some beautiful soft backgrounds. Being a relatively wide-angle lens, that means you can feature some more of the landscape in your shots but still hold the viewer's attention exactly where you want it. Of course, there's no rule that says you have to shoot at f1.7, and you can see here I've given the shot a lot more depth of field by shooting this one at f11. Now, I know the big question a lot of people will be asking about is sharpness, and I'm satisfied that this lens is sharp enough for most purposes throughout the aperture range. But I did get the sense that it's not perfectly sharp at f1.7, so I did this little test in my garden using a tripod and 2-second delay. The first shot is at f1.7, the second shot the aperture's closed down a few notches to f2.8. On close examination you can see the fine detail is that little bit sharper at f2.8. So for those people who really take sharpness seriously, I suggest you use the f1.7 when you really need it in low light, but consider closing the aperture down or stop or two the rest of the time. So let's get back to that question of what I would find the lens useful for. Well, the answer is it pretty much matches our original list. I've done some beach landscape images and found it great for a beautiful, clear, sharp image as long as I don't need a huge wide angle. When sunset came, I found myself wishing for a wider angle to get a big sky and plenty of foreground. It turned out my best bet was to go vertical, and it took some creative thinking to get some shots I was happy with. My favourite shot of this sunset is a merged panorama made from 8 vertical images taken on the 15mm lens. So it can be a great lens for landscape, but it does have limitations. I also met up with my friend Celina for some Halloween portrait photos. Normally I would be taking photos like this one shot on the 45mm portrait lens. This time around I took the opportunity to mix in a few shots with the 15mm f1.7. This added some really interesting variety to the shoot because it changed the perspective and introduced more of the environment into the shots. It was a very cloudy day, so the wide aperture came in really handy, and the eye detection autofocus worked a treat. So for the people who suggested this lens for environmental portraits, I'm going to give it a big tick. The other popular suggestions were for street photography, indoor events like wedding receptions, and other types of low-light photography. Well, I haven't had a chance to try any indoor events, but I did wander around the streets of Caloundra one evening to try my luck after dark. I wanted to test how well I would go shooting fairly slow shutter speeds handheld. This lens doesn't have its own stabilizer, so you don't get the dual stabilization that I've come to expect from my Panasonic lenses. But it turns out the in-body stabilization on the G9 is more than enough, and I was shooting at speeds as slow as 1/10 of a second and still getting decent results. And why is that important? Well, it means I don't have to pump the ISO way up, and I don't have to shoot at f1.7 all the time. And that adds a great deal of versatility to how you can use this lens in low light. And that brings us to the end of my first look at the Leica Panasonic 15mm f1.7 lens. I would happily recommend this lens to anyone who prefers prime lenses over a zoom and who's looking for a wide angle that's not ultra wide. It's compact and lightweight, it's easy to use, and most importantly it's capable of producing great quality images. At f1.7 it does really well in low light, although it is that little bit sharper when you close the aperture down a bit. It's a great lens for certain purposes. Whether it would suit your purpose, well, only you can be the judge of that. So, if you've made it all the way to the end of the video, thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. I've got more photography goodies on the way, so keep an eye out for what comes next. For now, I'm Andrew Goodall, this is Nature's Image Photography, thanks for watching.